you all for being here today in this, with this graduation presentation of mine. Thank you all members of the committee to judge me on what I've delivered. I will talk to you today about the brand identity of a small software company named Sense. And before we go into the scientific details, I would first like to tell you about the practical setting in which this research has taken place. Well, as I told, the research has been done during an internship at the company Sense Observation Systems, or Sense for short. And that's a small software company that develops smartphone apps. And they, in those apps, they build context awareness using the data they gather from the multiple sensors that are in the smartphone itself. And what you could think of is, for example, a automatic sports tracker, which you have on your phone and which is constantly on, which measures whether or not you are running, cycling, or walking, so that you can count how many calories you've burned and without having to switch it on every time. So then even the small sprints you take to the bus or to the train, they are taken into account. Well, because they collect lots of data to recognize what you are doing and what your current state is, that collection of data is associated with risks to privacy. They are very aware of those risks, or the perceived risks by the users, and they would like to use their vision on privacy, or their ideas on how privacy should be managed, and make it into a unique selling point for their company. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now for the outline of this report, or this presentation, I'm first going to tell you something about the research question, scientific practical relevance of the research, and the methodology that has been applied to answer the question. After that, I will show you what results we obtained from the research and what items there are left open for discussion. And in the end, we'll close off with the conclusion. The main research question for this project was how to manage the corporate brand of Sense observation systems so as to encompass the principles on end-user privacy present within the corporation. Well, what you see here, there's the term privacy, which is by itself quite a complex construct, which is not easily measured. How good are you in your privacy? It has many aspects. And the corporate brand itself is also something which can be seen as complex, because there's many stakeholders and influencers involved in the development of a brand identity or a corporate brand. For example, when you have a large brand such as Mars, you can immediately come up with terms which connect to the brand. Like, it gives you energy and those kinds of things. For Sense, they wanted to develop terms which could be related to their brand. So that people think, Sense, oh, that's this and this regarding privacy. The relevance of this research is, of course, practical, because we are going to find an answer to the question, which is also an advice for Sense on how they can manage their corporate brand. And this advice, or the method developed, can also give insight for the communication manager, or for a communication manager, on how to find out where to apply pressure in the network of influencers. Scientific relevance. Well, brand management is usually been looked at from a top-down perspective, that you say, well, we've got this idea of what brand we have, and then the brand manager itself should do this and this and this. Here we are looking at is already present within the network of influencers, and how can we use that to our advantage in building a concept which fits the company itself. And it also includes non-manageable influencers, such as legislation, external stakeholders which you do not have an influence on, but which do have an effect on your brand. Well, to answer the question, I've performed 8 interviews with members of Sense, and those interviews were done using a conceptual model which was based upon multiple theories on brand management, on privacy, and also on actor network theory, which covers the network of influencers. From that, the interviews, we gained insight into how the network of influencers, what it looks like. And with that insight into that network, we were then able to develop an advice which very much fits the identity of Sense. Well, as I said, I interviewed 8 people connected to Sense. I said that they're employees of Sense, but they're not all employees of Sense, because the communication manager, who also does the communications, the external communications for Sense, is located at the mother company of the parent company of Sense, which is called Almende. And because Sense is a spin-off of this company, I've also interviewed the CEO of Almende, who was also responsible for part of the vision which has been developed into Sense. We now come to the section of the results, where I will first inform you about how privacy was perceived within the network and what terms were associated with privacy by the respondents of the interviews. And after that, I will show you how the network of actors, what kind of actors were in the network, and also what the advice looked like that we gave to the company. Well, from privacy, from literature, there were, we developed a list of 7 aspects related to privacy, but from the theoretical list, there were only 5 of these aspects which were related to Sense. You can see them here. It's openness and transparency, which is about having no secret records or not keeping data from people of which the people are unaware, and clear communication on that data. Individual participation is all about the ability to edit or to change the data collected about you. Use limitation goes into sharing or selective sharing of your data, and also a concern linked to that is the concern of secondary use of your data, so that some company collects your data and that you're afraid that other companies will also do something with that data. Reasonable security is about security, data safety, and also keeping more sensitive data more secured. Accountability, that covers compliance with the aspects mentioned above, and also that you as a record keeper should be responsible in your handling of the data, and also be accountable for your actions, what you do with the data. From the interviews, we also found 2 new aspects related to Sense. They were not mentioned in the relevant literature that we found. And the first aspect is individual ownership, which covers the idea that the data collected about a user is property of that user instead of property of the one who collects the data. And then we have company access denial, which covers the idea that when you as a company collect data for someone and you are the keeper of that data, then you may also not want to be able, or you should not be able to look into that data. That's quite difficult to technologically, to make that possible. But it has been mentioned in many of the interviews, so that's why we also took this into account. And there were two aspects not related to sense, which were collection limitation, which covers the limitation of the amount of data that you collect and whether or not the data that you collect is reasonable to collect for the purpose that you set beforehand. But in the example that I gave, with the automatic recognition of whatever sports you are doing, it might be necessary to collect more data from which you do not know beforehand if it is useful for the task set beforehand. Because it might, for example, be very useful to see whether or not your light sensor registers light or darkness. Maybe when you go cycling, you mount your telephone on your bike and then there's always light coming in. But when you go running, then you put it in your pocket and then there's no light. So there might be more useful information from sensors which you do not see as useful just in the beginning. Then there's data quality, which is about errors which come into data over time. So for example, when you have a form asking you about your age, then when you fill in, well, I'm 28, then in a year, it is already no longer relevant or no longer true. And for sense, this aspect does not really matter because sense collects the data and applies a timestamp to it. So over time, the data will still say, well, at that moment, we registered this input from the sensor. How we visualize the network of actors or influencers was by using 6 identity types related to the corporate brand. These 6 identity types were based upon a model by Ballmer, who defined different identity types and how they together make the corporate brand. But from his model, there was one identity type which covers both the people in the company and the products in the company. But we've also learned that people and products, especially regarding privacy and the implementation thereof, were not always the same. People might think, well, privacy is very important, but they might not implement it in the software. And therefore, the top 2 identity types, personnel and product, are the result of the splitting of the actual identity type. Within these identity types, we then put all the actors that we found during the interviews. And in total, we found 75 actors. They're not all visualized in this representation. And after that, we linked the privacy aspects which came up during the interview to each of the actors. So now we know for each actor whether or not he thinks that use limitation is important, that regional security is important, or not. You might also say, well, it's just rubbish, don't use it. And because we know what each of the actors think, we can also combine them into clusters, so that the later insight obtained from this data is better to see in just one overview. Well, the 10 clusters that we've defined were the clusters which are named here. For personnel, there's the extensive and the selected cluster based upon how much aspects of privacy were linked to the personnel. For products, there's the old and the new cluster. It's mostly about whether or not the software has been developed in recent time when there's been more effort into making the products work on their privacy. all clustered into one cluster. For the conceived identity, there were three unique clusters, which is the Almenda cluster, containing the parent company of the company, and also all the sibling companies related to Sense. The health cluster contains mostly stakeholders who think that it's important to keep all the data to themselves. At least that was the general conclusion for that cluster. And the general conclusion for the sports cluster is that the organizations in this cluster think that, well, if we've got data, we want to share it with everybody. So they're not that concerned on their privacy. Then there's the market, which makes up the ideal identity, because the ideal identity informs you about what the best place would be for your company in the market. And the vision of the top management of Sense and Almenda is put into the desired identity. From this overview, we constructed landscapes, privacy landscapes, as you might call them. We see here the two privacy landscapes that have been constructed for the two privacy aspects which have been mentioned by most of the respondents as being a good idea to put into the brand identity of the company. And as you can see with the aspect of use limitation on the left, there's lots of clusters in the small green surfaces which are linked to the central aspect in the visualization. The more or the closer the clusters, the gray squares, are to the central aspect in this circular representation, the better they fit to that aspect. So if you would see these two next to each other, you can immediately see that for the right one, the reasonable security, in the product identity, there's still something missing to make it possible to say, well, reasonable security is present in that identity type. And because of all the clusters linked almost directly to the central aspect in use limitation, we decided to advise the company to focus on the aspect of use limitation at first. Well, to make sure that you can put use limitation as a central aspect in your corporate identity, you need to say, how are we going to represent it? Well, use limitation by itself says very technical things about, well, you should not give the data to others, and you have to be selective about with who you share. And most of the terminology used there is very technical and onto the product level. But because we want to have an aspect which covers all these identity types, it might be better to use a more general description, such as symbolic features, which might be something like conversations or enabling conversations, and functional features such as selecting with whom you have your conversation. We also advise to develop some stable elements which can be added to the network. Stable elements, in theory, are defined as, for example, products which are written down on paper, or physical objects which have been made, and they're deemed more stable than, for example, the thoughts in people's minds. One of the advised options is to add a corporate slogan, which directly influences the communicated identity, but also, because of the visibility of the aspect of use limitation, will influence other identity types. That's the same with all suggestions because they showcase product which really shows what you can do when you really embrace the concept of use limitation. Might also show to the conceived identity, to your external stakeholders, what they can do with use limitation. An explicit market strategy is also advised to use for the company because at this moment a really written down strategy on where do we want to be the next year, what do we want to do, is not written down. It's everybody seems to know it, but to make it more explicit would help in steering your strategy more towards the values that you hold dearly as a company. Also related to that is the advice to write down the corporate vision, perhaps in a story form, like in 10 years we believe that the world should be this and this and this, and that this story would also have in it all the values that you as a company hold dearly. Okay, those were the results from the research. From these results, or during the research, we encountered some novelties compared to the theory that we used, and also during the process there were some parts which could be improved upon. And further items for improvement can be found in the future work, or in the suggestions therefore. Well, in privacy research, we found that insight in the distribution of privacy values was also quite new, related to the field of privacy research, and it also links this field with the field of brand management. Also the new privacy aspects that I told you about in the results were new in relation to the theory. In brand management, we found that insight through visual representation of the network surrounding the corporate brand is, in itself, it's not entirely new, but the model that we based our work upon was only useful to show misalignment between identity types. But in our visualization, we could also see where there are identity types where there's both agreement and disagreement with an aspect. And that's something new. What's also new is the splitting of the people or the personnel and the product identity, or the actual identity, into these two identity types. And we also used the link types, so the description, whether or not something is agreeing with a central concept or disagreeing with the central concept, was used in the literature that we based it upon only for products, and here we used it for the entire corporate identity. Well, during the process, we found two possibilities of a bias, which is in the selection of respondents. There we selected only people internal to the company, and it might be the case that these people do not know what happens outside of the company. But we use the assumption that a company or people within a company that have been there so long that they know what the company is like, they have also encountered external parties and interacted with them. So they have also developed a sense of what those companies or those stakeholders think like. In the interpretation of data, there were some possibilities for observer bias, because the interviews were all individual interviews, and they were combined into one representation of the actor network that was done by myself. So there, my interpretation of that data is a cause for observer bias, or might cause observer bias. a validation of this model that we developed by communication professionals, so they can see how useful the concept is, and if it can be applied to other companies, to other aspects or other concepts perhaps, because now we only applied it to this company sense and only to the concept of privacy. But perhaps you can also use it for other things. Similarity measures. For now, we've only developed a similarity measure which is useful for linking an actor to one aspect and seeing if it agrees, disagrees, or we don't know, or it's neutral. But perhaps it would also be a good idea to see how a brand which has already been developed and is already in action, which has multiple aspects or multiple concepts within the brand identity, how that links to all the actors in the network. And the visual representation that we've made might also benefit from the ability to change perspective, because now we see the network only centered around the brand identity. But perhaps you would like to see how your specific group of employees is within the whole network. Or another option is what would be the possible effect of adding elements to the network. And what would that look like? Would that change the whole layout of the network? So the visual representation could be improved so as to show the network a bit more. And by showing or using the network itself, it could also become possible to identify changes over time. Because now we've only taken 1 week in which I've interviewed all the employees, and there wasn't that much there was not that much research into how do the opinions of these people or of the whole network, how does that change over time when we add, for example, this stable element which should improve the brand identity. So now we get back to the research question to draw the main conclusion of this research. The research question, as you've seen before, is how to manage the corporate brand of sense observation systems so as to encompass the principles on end-user privacy present within the corporation. Well, we've seen that privacy is an aspect which, or is a construct which has many aspects to it, and that the brand identity itself is also covered by a whole network. So they're both, not that simple to measure, to see, and we therefore developed this visualization, which can be used as a brand management tool, and it instantly provides insight in how a specific concept is in relation to all the influencers of the brand itself. And we think that it might help to inform, to make informed decisions about which concepts are best fitting to the brand identity. That's the presentation that I wanted to give to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Switch back to Dutch. Melanie, if you want to ask a question in English, then let's go ahead. Zijn er vragen? Opmerkingen, suggesties? Ideeën? Ja. Ja? Melanie, go ahead.
I really like that tool. It's really awesome, I think. But then I was wondering, say I'm a brand manager and I would like to use this visual tool. Would there be another way than doing interviews? Because maybe I don't have time to do interviews with everyone. But yeah, so how could I collect
because, as I've said, there's also lots of possibility for observer bias by doing all these individual interviews and combining them into one network. I've made a couple of extra slides so I can show you. This is how I view the observer bias. And you see here on the left side of the dashed line that there are 8 times an interview with the employee, which takes, well, 1 hour to interview, and then also time to process. And it takes 1 employee and 1 researcher, at least 1 hour, and then extra time for the researcher. And besides that, there's also, with all the lines crossing the dashed line, there's interpretation being done by the researcher. And also all the arrows going from privacy labels to clustered entities, that is where the researcher makes an interpretation. So how to improve on that and how to make it also useful for communication professionals might be by having all the employees and putting them together and letting them make the actor network and having them decide what they think are the values of the company and how they are distributed in that network. So I think that with such a method, it would be more useful for communication professionals also, because the communication professional can directly make the privacy landscapes when the group is still around, because the construction of a privacy landscape itself is not the most difficult thing to do. And then based upon the insights obtained from the landscape, the suggestions obtained from that can directly be fed back into the group of employees. So I think that putting all your respondents together and letting them in a group session develop the network and the value distribution on that would make it more useful for communication professionals. Does that answer your question?
But then my next question is, why didn't you do that?
Why didn't I do that?
Something that you discovered later on.
Yeah, this was also because of the explorative nature of the research that we've decided to do individual interviews. Yeah, so that's why the individual interviews were used.
Yeah.
Would it be correct to assume that with this model I can also say my own identity, say the identity of me? But assuming that I can just say you can do this without an interview, by collecting data from a major group, would the same model apply?
You would say
Instead of sense, the type of the center circle would be Matthijs.
Yeah. And all the values that you think apply to you.
Yeah, or how the world observes me, or what I want to be in the world.
Well, what you want to be in the world depends. Do you have products which are special Matthijs products
Well, we could
or
say
services?
that I am a project when I'm going in for a job interview.
Okay. Because you need to fill in all of these identity types.
Yeah, so I think we can come up with 6
I think
identity types.
we can come up with a network of things that are expressions of your identity, and that may count up to 1 Matthijs.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that it's possible, but maybe not in this in 6 identity types per se.
Okay.
But to do that, we would have to look more into identity on a personal level, and maybe there's literature which is more suited to apply to this model then. Okay.
Actually, it's a very good question, because all these theories come from psychology and sociology, and it's human-based actually. So, very good question. If you can use yourself as the fundamental point of a marketing and branding system. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful.
Were you looking for the privacy measures that were taken by the company, or for the perceived privacy the employees were thinking they were giving to the end user?
Well, what I asked the respondents to the interviews, let's see if we can bring this slide up, is for each of the identity types. I first asked them which actors are responsible for that, and then what those actors would value as privacy concept. So it is, in a sense, about the perceived values of privacy perceived by the internal members of a company. So that's also something which needs validation to see if it is possible to draw such conclusions based upon only the internal respondents.
Yeah, because that was the second question. If the brand identity is something that is perceived by the end user, and now you're using internal sources, built outside view of the company. Have you ever thought about using the end user of products as an input for this model? Because in the bias,
Yeah.
see again the employees and not the end user.
Yeah. Yeah, we have thought about that, but yeah, because of time limitations and availability of employees, we chose to include only the employees. I did do an interview with one external stakeholder, but because the recordings of that were damaged, I could not include them in my results.
Was that an end user, or was it a company where Sense is building a version 4?
Yeah, it's not not an end user per se. It was a company for whom Sense developed the software. So the end user itself is also not directly included in this network, because most of the products that Sense develops, they don't develop it saying this is Sense, this is Sense. They say this is the product name, and the product name is then marketed by all the companies that they work for.
Okay, one last question, remark.
Walter?
You showed us two aspects that were mentioned by the employees, but you looked at 7 different aspects. And since you only looked at these two, I was just wondering, as a researcher, you do have a different approach to things. So did you also look at the other 5? And were they also interesting to look at, to incorporate in the brand identity?
Yes, I have looked at them. I put them on this slide here. And what's interesting about all these visualizations is that you can immediately see where there are points that need attention to when you would like to have this aspect, which is company access denial, to be your core concept in your brand identity. Then you can see, well, we definitely need to work on the product identity to make this concept work for us. And what's nice to see is that there's lots of diversity in these images. That not one image is the same, and we therefore also think that this method can deliver useful insight into which concept or which aspect to choose as a central concept within the brand identity, because of the shown diversity in these pictures.
So, let's say the second one from the left at the top.
Yeah.
That one seems very green.
With
very-
pencil.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have looked at it. Only because we also wanted to advise to use a concept which is also being associated with Sense, or that employees of Sense want to associate with Sense, we've chosen to pick one of the two aspects that the employees themselves named as aspects that they would favor as part of their brand identity. But yeah, the second identity type, or the second privacy aspects, which is individual participation, would also yeah, fit the company in some way or another. But there are lots of actor clusters which are in the middle ring, and the middle ring is either that from the interviews there was no clear positive or negative association with the concept, or that there was no mentioning of the concept at all in relation to that actor cluster. So it's a bit unclear how much effort it would take. And if you look at the total image, there's only 4 actor clusters out of the 10 that are really in the positive side. But a good thing about individual participation here is there are no actor clusters in the negative, or in the outer ring. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Sort of.
It also gives me more questions, because I don't know if you have more time.
Actually not. No. Oké. Dankjewel nogmaals voor het beantwoorden.
Okay.